Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us today for this policy research talk. So these policy research talks are an opportunity for us to present the work that's coming out of the research department at the World Bank, with the goal of sharing among ourselves within the department, with our colleagues in the other parts of the research of the World Bank and outside of the research department, as well as people outside the World Bank as well. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dion Filmer. I'm the new Director for Research here in the Development Economics Vice Presidency. So I would just want to welcome the audience both on WebEx as well as on YouTube. Please use the chat function in whatever platform you're using to ask questions and provide comments. We'll be monitoring both of those, and that'll feed into the Q&A part of this talk. So today's talk is going to focus on electricity and its important role in modern economic activity. As you saw in the announcement, more than 800 million people lack even basic access to electricity services. And in many parts of the world, the power supply is limited and highly unreliable. So my colleague Jevgenijs Steinbuks will discuss key methodological challenges associated with this kind of work, this kind of research, discuss advances and key findings from the literature, the emerging literature on the topic, and then he'll focus a little bit on his own work and provide a discussion of the policy insights and the lessons learned from his own recent, mostly empirical work. Jevgenijs is an economist in the Sustainability and Infrastructure team of the Development Research Group, whose research focuses on energy and also on environmental economics, industrial organization, and real estate and urban economics, with a particular emphasis on households and firms' investment problems. We're really grateful to have Vivian Foster here as a discussant today. Vivian is the chief economist for the Infrastructure Vice Presidency of the World Bank, which covers the areas of digital development, energy and extractives, transport, and infrastructure finance. She's held a number of, for those of us who've been in the bank, she's held a number of leaderships. You will know that she has held a number of leadership positions across the institution, including the one prior to her current position when she was the global lead for energy economics, markets, and institutions. And prior to that, she was the practice manager of the Global Energy Anchor. So with that, let me turn it over to Jevgenijs, who will talk for about 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Vivian for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with Q&A that I'll hopefully moderate effectively. And as I said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll draw the questions from the audience from the chat function. So with that, over to you, Jevgenijs.
Thank you very much, Dion. Before I start, I just want to triple check if my voice is clear enough and the PPT is visible.
It's fine from where I see, and then I see someone in the chat saying yes.
Fantastic. So let's get right to the chase. Oh. So I would like to start my talk with very simple yet very important observation that electricity is critical to life of many, in fact, any modern household or business, as electricity powers appliances necessary for production of agricultural goods, industrial goods, and transportation and recreation services. Electricity is also important for provision of essential public services, such as healthcare and education, but also defense and security, among others. Yet, about 800 million people still live without electricity. This is about 10% of the world population. And these households are mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia regions. So these people don't have even basic electricity services. Electricity availability is particularly challenging problem in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. In many countries of the region, particularly landlocked economies of the Central Africa, but also in other parts. Electricity access is limited to only a small number of areas, typically urban areas, and cover only a small fraction of the population. Even when electricity is available in many parts of the world, it is highly unreliable. In these countries, each month, households and businesses experience long and frequent power outages. Sometimes these outages are announced. This happens when electricity demand exceeds available electricity supply, the phenomenon the power sector specialists call load shedding. And sometimes these outages are not announced. That happens when power system experience technical failures and the authorities simply don't have time to warn the people that power outages are coming. Regardless whether outages are announced or not announced, power outages are very damaging to economic well-being. The international community is, of course, very well aware of this problem. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 7 says, for example, that by 2030, each country should ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. Of course, that's easier said than done. Ensuring electricity access on the universal basis is very costly, even despite recent technological improvements and renewables revolution. The International Energy Agency, the world's leading institution covering energy issues, for example, estimates that by 2030, closing access gap or ensuring universal access requires investment of $52 billion per year. This is twice as much that is currently being spent on electrification efforts. For Africa alone, achieving universal access would cost no less than $19 billion per year, and that's accounts for roughly 50%, 45% of continent's total official development assistance influx. So increasing aid to improve electricity access would draw resources from scarce development assistance aimed at other important development goals, such as health, education, governance, access to finance, other infrastructure investments, and other notable goals. And this is precisely why understanding economic benefits of electricity availability is so important. Armed with accurate estimates of economic benefits of improved electricity availability, policymakers and private developers will not only know that they need to invest in electricity access, something that is obvious to everyone, but also where to invest, including development of electrification plans, which part of electricity system to invest. Is it investment in electricity generation, transmission, or distribution segment? Which sources of investment to use? Does it need to be a public investment or private sector can deliver? And whether to invest at all or try to improve the governance of existing power sector resources. It is very well known to even causal observers that electricity is a high correlate of development. Richer countries consume more electricity, and the relationship, as depicted on this chart, is highly stable across time and country spaces. But making causal claims is far more challenging. And why so? Well, as it turns out, there is a number of reasons why. I found 6, but probably there are many more. So let's go one by one and try to elaborate on them. First is the measurement. The problem is that electricity access is a non-binary variable. In developed economies, there is a grid access, and households and businesses use very powerful high wattage appliances like heating and air conditioners. In other countries where grid supply is not reliable or not available, people could still use off-grid solutions like solar power devices. And sometimes these small solar power devices are sufficient only to power a flashlight or a cellular phone. Obviously, the difference between these two situations is tremendous. The World Bank, of course, understands this problem and came up with its own measure of electricity access called the multi-tier framework, or MTF, in which case the electricity is bundled to different tiers, shown here. So we see tier 0 is no electricity access, and tier 1 is access to very basic electricity services, and then we progress to tier 2, 3, and 4, and 5, which is the most advanced tier, including the high power electricity appliances. But of course, this measurement is not without its own problem. For example, it's unclear how would you quantify the economic benefits of moving from tier 1 to tier 2 versus tier 4 to tier 5. Obviously, the move from nothing to something is more valuable than the move from a lot to really a lot. Right. So that's obviously a problem. Similarly, we have problems on the reliability side measurement. We need to distinguish whether reliability problems are caused by high frequency of power outages or long duration of power outages, and whether these outages are anticipated by the customers or unanticipated. Right. So the measurement issues are highly important. The second problem is data availability. Indeed, good data on electricity availability is very difficult to collect. Yes, the aggregate data is available because international forces, and particularly International Energy Agency, has created amazing database for collating aggregate electricity consumption data from nearly all over the world. So the world's utilities routinely report to the AEA the number of aggregate electricity consumed. But less aggregate data is so important and so critical for making robust economic analysis is often lacking. It doesn't mean that the data doesn't exist. It's just getting the data is so problematic. Utilities, for example, do have this data, but for obvious reasons, and these reasons are commercial, they rarely share them with general public and researchers. The World Bank's instruments, very popular instruments such as household LSMS service and enterprise service, typically say very little about energy and electricity components. So the knowledge on electricity consumption from this service is very basic and not sufficient. The recent MTF service, multi-tier framework service, were designed to partially alleviate this problem. And they have a highly rich and disaggregated data on different parts and aspects of electricity consumption and use at the households and business level. This is extremely promising and important initiative. However, it's been very recent. It's only rolled out to a handful of countries. And moreover, we need to collect the longitudinal data, and collecting this data will take many more years before we can reap the full benefits of the MTF service. Some help may come from recent advances in the big data and machine learning methods. So this chart, for example, shows a study which attempts to use night light satellite data to measure long-term electricity access. And indeed, the study finds some strong positive correlations between electricity access and satellite imagery in the case of India. However, these methods are only emerging, and though they're constantly improving, still a long way before they can be fully deployed to remedy data availability issues and be a full substitute for the actual data. Third, we obviously have a reverse causality problem. We know from the economic theory that electricity availability poses many reasons to affect economic growth, including consumption channels, but also investment channels, both physical capital and human capital investments, and both private investment and the public infrastructure investment. However, electricity availability itself is a function of economic well-being. To demonstrate this point, let me briefly go through over two of my recent research studies. In the first study, we were exploring the willingness to pay for electricity access in Sub-Saharan African countries, and we picked up three poor countries of the SSA region: Rwanda, Senegal, and Burkina Faso, where electrification, and we looked at the rural areas where electrification were lacking. So we asked poor households in Africa how much they're willing to pay for electricity connection or for electricity access. And the answers to this question were very reasonable, but unfortunately, they were not very encouraging. The households indeed were willing to pay a lot, up to 10% of their monthly income. But that amount was barely sufficient to afford paying for a solar lantern, which is the most basic form of electricity availability. In the second study, and this is a joint work with one of my colleagues in research group, Govinda Timilsina, we look into Nepalese households' willingness to pay for improved electricity reliability after the end of decade-long load shedding crisis, which started in 2008 and ended in 2017. As you can see from this chart, Nepali regulator, Nepali Electricity Authority, managed to eliminate the load shedding, and duration of expected power outages in residential sectors has fallen from 50% in a daytime in January 2016 to 0 in December month. So we came and asked the Nepali households using the MTA framework how much they are willing to pay to avoid returning to situation 1 year ago when the electricity supply were less reliable. And again, the answer was quite a bit. They were willing to pay up to 65% of their monthly electricity bill. But this large amount was not sufficient to cover the marginal cost of ensuring reliable power supply. The fourth problem is something called firm selection. Even if we were to fully observe the data on energy use and measure them accurately, and if we could observe the data on business economic activity, we need to keep in mind that some businesses do better when electricity is a problem than others. So industrial composition of businesses will likely be different should power supply be fully available. Vivian, who is our today's discussant, once aptly labeled this problem as camels in the desert. Indeed, as you can see from this chart, the share of businesses in agriculture is higher in countries with less reliable power supply, which may be indicative of the problem. The problem number 5 is that power markets, unlike many other markets, are notoriously distorted. And creating functional and competitive power markets is very difficult, as been rightly summarized by a fundamental report that Vivian led last year and the upcoming IFC report on creating power markets. When the power markets are not functional, they often fail delivering economically efficient outcomes. The distortions can go from upstream, which includes distortion in the pricing of the fuel inputs for power generation and their transportation efficiencies. Remember that power generation requires, it doesn't go by itself unless we talk about renewables, but even in that case, they don't go by itself. Something needs to power electric power plants, and that something can be costly and not efficiently distributed. We also have the downstream distortions, which include, for example, underpricing, the setting electricity tariffs below the marginal cost of power supply, and other problems like cross-subsidization and exercise of market power. So why distorted power markets is a problem for the questions we're trying to ask? Well, first of all, these distortions are pointing out that we cannot just look in the growth in electricity. There are many other immediate factors in this problem. And that raises valid question whether improving economic outcomes requires greater investment in electricity availability, or the same outcomes can be attributed by just improving the markets themselves, right? So if we can improve the governance of the power sector and make it better run, can that deliver economically efficient outcomes? So to illustrate this problem, let me give you several examples. The first example is about the upstream distortion, and we are looking particularly in the power sector in India. Much of the Indian power generation are coal-fired power plants. There are plenty of cheap coal in India, so having a coal is not a problem per se. What is a problem that we need to deliver this coal to the power plants? The coal is typically delivered by railways, and railways in India are highly congested. So a recent study by our colleagues in the South Asia Chief Economist Office finds that the further the plants are located from the coal supply points, and the points are mines and the harbors, which deliver imported coal, the longer is the delay and the higher the coal shortages to power the plants. So the lower is the utilization rate of the power plants. And then what makes things worse is that very often the most efficient power plants in India are actually the ones which are located far away from the coal mines. The newer plants, and they were built further away. So obviously we have economic inefficiency here. Let me give you another example, and that's an example of a downstream distortion due to underpricing. Why underpricing is such a problem? Well, for electricity availability. Well, the problem is that power utilities tend to maximize the profits. And they do so by either choosing electricity tariffs or connection charges, or the combination of both. So here in our study, we find, we devised a curve that maximizes utilities profits as a function of optimal connection charge and electricity price. Now, the problem is when there is underpricing, the electricity tariffs are set below the marginal cost, and electricity loses money on each connected customer down that segment. So in order to make up for the losses, utility may want to raise the connection charges, and it often does. So when the connection charges go up, the electricity access falls. So the underpricing paradoxically lowers electricity access, as our model is predicting. So in this setup, interestingly enough, higher electricity tariffs may rise electricity access. Though the relationship is, of course, nonlinear, and if you keep hiking electricity tariffs, the excess will necessarily fall. The final problem, which I think is highly important for understanding economic effects of electricity availability, is something which I call the network externalities. The network externalities arise from the nature of electricity transmission grid. The grid is a highly sophisticated system, as you can see from this chart. It has many lines and it has many nodes which connect the lines. Now, the problem is that electricity storage is very costly. It can be stored, and recent advances in battery storage is helping, but still it's very, very, very expensive. And for the electric grid to function, we need the electricity supply and electricity demand at each node should be equal in each period of time. This happens in the real time. So in order to make this happen, the electricity grid exercises highly sophisticated software which balance supply and demand. So even if a generation unit fails in one of the grid nodes, another generation unit can come up live at the same period of time, and the software calls these units to increase the electricity dispatch. So this makes the electricity grid resilient, but it also complicates life of the researcher because very often economic research attempts to isolate exogenous shock. The economists also call this exogenous variation or local exogenous variation to understand the effects of the shock on economic activity. When you have a network, this simply is not possible. With the exception of certain circumstances, I don't want to talk at this point, as I'm becoming very technical. So, which brings me to the second part of this talk. What researchers have done to address these problems. There are different approaches that researchers have tried to do to answer these questions. The first approach, and it's probably the most established research in energy economics literature, is drawing from the macroeconomic literature of the 1990s and employs the time series data. So if you Google on the Google Scholar issues related to electricity consumption, economic growth, the most cited papers will come on the time series, and they will use tools like Granger causality, error correction model, BER, and others. These methods are very popular because of two reasons. The first reason is availability of data. As I told you earlier, aggregated data are available for most countries of the world. The second advantage of this approach, it's very simple. You don't need to know a whole lot to run the Granger causality test, and most statistical packages do that routinely. But there are problems with that approach. One problem is that they use essentially high-frequency approach to use low-frequency data. So this approach works better in financial time series when granularity is seconds, not years. And the second, this approach can only establish direction, but not necessarily magnitude of the effect. And the third problem, this is completely atheoretical approach. So all we can find that the model delivers certain result, but we don't know where and why this result is coming from. The second approach is coming from the trade literature, and it's called the CGE models, computable general equilibrium models. The idea here is to use a set of equations in the fully functioning markets to pick up the quantitative effects of electricity availability. These tools are also very popular because they are based on the theory. They require some data, much more data than time series methods, but still less data than others. And most importantly, they help elucidating the general equilibrium effects of electricity availability. It's something that researchers would like to find. So on this chart, we show one of the examples of the paper that I wrote with Govinda on economic effects of ending load shedding crisis in Nepal using CGE model. And we find that, at least according to CGE model predictions, that the effect was very strong. The GDP would have been 7% higher if load shedding crisis didn't happen. And investment channel was a key in this driving these results. So basically, our model is telling us that load shedding can significantly suppress investment, which resulted in the growth. And we are able to tease out these effects across different sectors and across different commodities. Now, CGE models have a lot of problems of their own. First of all, they have to rely on elasticities, and these elasticities needs to be rigorously estimated. Unfortunately, that often doesn't happen. So many parameters of CGE models are loosely calibrated. The second problem with the CGE models is they don't really represent power sector well. For them, it's just one or two equations. They don't differentiate between different types of power sector generation, the transmission constraints, and many other granular features of the power sector. And that's not surprising because these models are coming from the trade. They're not coming from the energy sector literature. And very often CGE models deliver comparative static results. So they say we are in the point one and we're moving from 20 years from now. They don't really tell anything how the adjustment would happen. Again, I'm not saying that all CGE models have these problems, but many do. The third approach is coming from development economics literature, and it's called randomized controlled trials. The RCTs are extremely popular in a very broad spectrum of development economics, and particularly in human development segment, where they became a staple of economic research. The advantages of randomized controlled trials are very well known. If properly done, they can deliver credible econometric identification and estimate marginal effects in unbiased and consistent way. Unfortunately, these experiments are not very common in the power sector, and there are very good reasons for that, as I'll explain in a minute. However, one recent study has been really path-breaking. This is a study by Lee, Miguel, and Wolfram, where they try to randomize electricity access connection charges in Kenya. And based on that, they were able to construct electricity demand curves. They also measured the take-up post randomization and saw what happens with the people that adopted electricity access. Unfortunately, the results for the economic development literature, the results of Lee, Miguel, and Wolfram study were very pessimistic. So they found that the willingness to pay for electricity access was very low and below the average cost of electricity production, which is the same result as one of my earlier studies shown above has found. Moreover, they didn't find significant development or economic benefits of improving electricity access over the medium term, and by medium term they define 24 months. Like any methods, RCTs have their own problems. First, and probably the most important problem, they're very difficult to implement. You need to persuade the government to randomize, and sometimes governments are not very happy about this. They take a very long time to do, and particularly in the infrastructure setting, they're very costly financially. Unless they are repeated, RCTs don't trace long-term effects. So Lee, Miguel, and Wolfram was really heroic effort, but they only able to trace 24 months. Very often, and the RCTs capture only partial equilibrium effects and focus on one market, like labor markets. And this was the story of Lee, Miguel, and Wolfram. They mainly looked at the labor effects. They didn't look at other effects. And at country-wise, there are external validity issues. So what happened in Kenya doesn't necessarily mean that in other countries we will see the same situation. The next approach, which is gaining traction and steam, is something that I would refer as exogenous variation approach, because this approach covers a number of different methods, of which instrumental variable approach is the most popular. But they share the same idea. You need to find, some part of the data generating process which shifts electricity access, but otherwise not correlated with economic development variables. And this information can be used to elicit causal effect of electricity availability on economic activity. And researchers have experimented with different ideas. What would constitute with the source of this exogenous variation? Some researchers came up with ideas of using topography. Others used availability of groundwater. The third set of researchers took advantage that hydropower is a very idiosyncratic thing, so we can play with availability of water and hydrological conditions. While other researchers try to generate optimal expansion plans based on engineering models that would reflect the optimal investment from the engineering standpoint and technical characteristics, but wouldn't necessarily be affected by economic activity. Like any approach, the exogenous variation approach has its own problems in power sector. First of all, it's very often specific to local context and technology. So every time you need to come up with your own source of exogenous variation. Very often these instruments are unstable. So attempts have been made to replicate these instruments and they failed. So the IVs are not necessarily robust. Another problem which I find is that constructing accurate instrument to extract the source of exogenous variation requires a lot of knowledge. It's a steep learning curve. You need to know a lot of power engineering and operations research to kind of come up with pure and good instrumental variable. So that's not something that can be replicated in a minute and quickly dirty for the energy practitioners working on these important questions. So all in all, what can we learn from this? Well, unfortunately, as an economist, I have to say it depends. And the empirical evidence is highly inconclusive. Some studies find significant effects of electrifications as shown on these two charts on both, say, labor supply and education and other parts of economic activity. These studies are mainly based on observational data, and these were observational studies. The other studies, which were mainly experimental, didn't find any significant effects of electrification, at least in the short run. Moreover, as I explained above, there is no methodological silver bullet. You cannot just say, well, you have to do this and you will answer the question. I don't believe that. I think you need to use different methods and use the best available machinery to answer this important question. So what I suggest needs to be done. Well, my approach leverages using causal inference methods, the best available ones, experimental or observational, to calculate key reduced form elasticities. And these methods can be used to identify the channels through which electricity availability affects economic outcomes. Armed with these estimates, we can construct economic models to construct scenarios and determine best policies to maximize economic gains from electricity availability improvements. And once these two elements are in place, we need to validate the model and validate the results using some sort of forecasting, or if you're Bayesian, posterior analysis. So you need to determine a model and test, and together you may come up with some rigorous insights on what electricity availability causes in terms of economic development. And of course, this needs to be replicated for many countries of the world to get a consistent evidence. So this is a difficult task, and a lot of work is ahead, at least in my view. Which drives me into the third part and the last time of that talk about what I have done in Brazil. So Brazil is a laboratory of research. I consider Brazil as a laboratory of research on long-term electricity availability. There are many advantages to that, as the country has undergone through massive expansion of electricity access over the last 4 decades. So in 70s, only part of the country, mainly in the south east, was electrified. And 4 decades from there, large parts of inhabited country was electrified. So there was a mass expansion along the coast up to the north and the center west. Remember, this is forest, so you don't want to electrify the forest. So the country has made through a drastic expansion of electricity access. Another important point is that in Brazil, electricity sector is highly dependent on renewable energy, and particularly hydroelectricity. This is stochastic by nature. That helps because we can exploit some random elements of availability of water to determine economic shocks to the system. And unlike many other countries, almost all Brazil's electricity is hydropower. So climatic and hydrologic conditions help a lot. So as you can see from this chart, for example, the hydrological conditions indeed matter in terms of affecting reliability of power supply. So you can see this red line on these charts is showing the number of power supply destruction events in Brazil. And though I don't show it, the availability of water is a key determinant of these major spikes. Finally, Brazil is a reasonably developed country in terms of data collection. So there is a high quality spatially disaggregated panel data going all the way back to 70s. And high quality firm level panel microdata going back to 1995. That's really a true gift for a researcher. In addition to that, we have strong partners in Brazil. So Brazil has a very strong domestic economic research infrastructure. So people know what's going on. They help us with data, and close collaboration effort is extremely valuable for moving this research agenda. So what we have managed to do so far, we have first conducted econometric analysis along the lines I outlined before. So we ran the panel regression analysis of electricity access measures on outcome variables, including growth, and structural transformation variables, including sectoral GDP shares. And here we took the force method, the exogenous variation approach. So we used the power second planning model previously done by other colleagues who worked in Brazil, based on topological and hydrological characteristics and the instrumental variable, to break the causal link between electricity access and economic development. So we argue that the hydropower expansion plan based on topological and hydrological conditions is definitely affected electricity access, but less correlated with otherwise with economic development. Based on the estimated econometric results, we come up with a model. We build a dynamic general equilibrium model of growth and structural transformation to see the key economic linkages between households, firms, and the government investment decisions in different sectors and different types of infrastructure. To analyze the key potential effects through which infrastructure can affect, electricity infrastructure can affect economic growth. So these charts, for example, shows that electricity availability matters significantly in terms of both growth and structural transformation. So we see that 1% in growth in electricity availability in Brazil resulted in 1.4% increase in services share in the economy. Why so? The key reason, as our model explains, is that electricity availability has lowered operational costs of businesses and accelerated growth of manufacturing and agriculture sectors by increasing their productivity. So they started to grow along the intensive margin. The productivity grew up and the cost has fallen, whereas services have grown along the extensive margin. They became larger in size, and the result, we have a structural transformation going on from inefficient to lean manufacturing, which captures smaller share of the economy, to services which captures larger share of the economy. We're also able to use a model to trace the economic effects. We build a counterfactual analysis, and we said, what happens if the grid investment stayed at the level of 70s? Not as now. And we see these had a significant effects on economic activity. So if we look at the GDP effects, for example, we see that GDP per capita, the average GDP per capita in Brazil would have been at least a third lower if the grid capacity were in the 70s level. This is a very significant economic result, which is telling us that in the long term, electrification does bring economic development and wealth. Because of the time constraints, I don't have time to say much about the structural transformation channels, but they matter. You know, we can see how from the model how electricity availability drives sectoral GVA shares and also the size of businesses in the economy. The final point I want to make, and based on my ongoing work in Brazil, is that although almost all talk of mine focused on one particular type of infrastructure, namely electricity, it's probably naive, is not wrong to say that electricity alone should matter for economic development. Electricity is a part of a big infrastructure picture. There are certainly significant complementarities between electricity access and access in other types of infrastructure, particularly roads. So if you look, for example, on the map of Brazil, you will see that expansion in electricity access as measured by these blue dots and black dots, the electricity generation capacity, is accompanied by expansion in the roads, the red lines. So over time, we have much more blue dots and black dots, but also around the same segments, we see a significant expansion of roads, the red lines. So electricity access and road access are coming together. So in the ongoing research still in progress, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, we're trying to use econometric analysis to measure the marginal effects of roads and electricity excess expansion on GVA jointly with my colleagues from Development Research Group. Our initial findings find that there is very strong complementarities of the two types of infrastructure. So if we build a road and we have electricity access, you know, we have a significant positive effect on economic growth. And over 4 decades, this amounts to a large amount. We're talking about 150 million Brazilian reais or 800 million US dollars, the cumulative effect. It's a very large effect. On the other hand, if electricity access happens without building major highways, the effect is not so big. In fact, it can be negative. So that points to a big issue that if you want to study electricity, you probably need to look at other things as well as a part of the bigger research project. I think it's a good time to end my talk. You know, I kept torturing you for 48 minutes, and that's a long time. And I think time has come to give a talk to esteemed discussant, Vivian. And I'm very keen to say what she thinks about this talk.
Thanks, Jevgenijs. Over to you, Vivian. I understand you're going to share your screen. Yeah, great.
Thanks very much, Jevgenijs. I hope I'm audible and visible. That was a really excellent talk. You masterfully weaved together so many different strands of the literature and told a compelling story about the challenges that we face really in the energy sector when we try to do serious research about our impact. I think this talk is designed to be a marriage of or a bridge between the research community and the practitioner community. And I'm here in a sense to bring that second practitioner or policy perspective to the story. I wanted to mention that a number of the things that Jevgenijs mentioned really resonated with me. The first one being the sheer challenges of data in the electricity sector. We are, in a very disadvantageous position, partly for various institutional, structural, historical reasons. But we feel that there's really a big data agenda in this sector that hopefully the World Bank can support an expansion of availability of the right kind of data to answer these questions. I also, sympathize very much with your points about the CGE models. I know that we, in the practice, have tried on different occasions to look at, use CGE models to look at the impact of subsidy reform, regional power trade, different aspects of the policy environment. And we've always met that same challenge that the representation of the power sector in the CGE model is necessarily, rather crude or limited, and it's quite difficult to pick up some of these effects. I also, sympathize with your view on the randomized controlled trials and this issue of the long-term effects. I know there's been quite a lot of work by Professor Modi at Columbia University looking at the fact that it does take quite a bit of time for households to actually pick up in electricity consumption, acquire the complementary appliances in order to get benefits out of an electricity connection. Nevertheless, I think it's also important to emphasize, and this I think came through also in a comment in the chat, that it's one thing to talk about the impact of electricity on economic development, which is really a channel through the productive sector to growth. And it's another thing to talk about whether electricity improves the welfare of poor households at the micro level. To me, those are two different questions to which we could potentially expect different answers, even in the same time and place. So I think that's another important angle on the RCT story. So what I would like to do is to complement these remarks, because I think on the practitioner side, we perhaps worry less about the fundamental question of why electricity, does electricity really drive economic development? And we focus more on the question of how do we improve electricity? And perhaps in doing that, we really rely on the fact that whether electricity is in the lead on economic development or whether it's merely a follower of economic development, the correlation, as Jevgenijs showed, is very strong. And therefore, in the countries where we work, the demand for improving power remains very high. So that, I think, is the narrower perspective that the practitioner might take. I'd like to briefly summarize, in the form of a number of conundrums, why it is so difficult to improve on the electricity situation in developing countries. Jevgenijs already told a compelling story about the poor quality of service, the poor coverage of service. But one angle that he didn't mention that I think is extremely important is the high cost of electricity in the developing world. Some of the world's poorest countries also face the most expensive electricity, in excess of 20 cents a kilowatt hour, which is roughly twice what we might think is reasonable, and up sometimes even as high as 40 or 50. And this is particularly a problem in small developing countries, landlocked countries, small island developing states, and countries that have a limited availability to primary energy resources. So not only is electricity, unavailable and poor quality, but it may also be exorbitantly expensive. And as you could imagine, that high cost is what drives a real lack of affordability. Jevgenijs touched upon the fact that in his research in Africa, there was high willingness to pay, but it still wasn't high enough to be able to afford the cost of the service. So we've looked at this issue across a number of countries. In the practitioner literature, a range of 5 to 10% of the household budget is considered reasonable from an affordability standpoint and matches up with what we see in household survey expenditure patterns. But you'll see here the low-income countries marked in orange, almost all of them are way above the 10% affordability threshold because their power is particularly high in terms of cost per kilowatt hour. And this is what lies behind this very disturbing truth, which came out strongly in the recent book by Musa Blimpo from the Africa Chief Economist's Office, that in Africa, you can lay out the electricity grid, but you may still get only about half of households actually connecting to the infrastructure when it's available in their communities. And so there's really a need in this sector to think beyond the supply side to try and address these kind of demand side barriers to electricity uptake. So the first conundrum is not only is electricity bad, it's expensive. The second conundrum is, despite being expensive, the tariffs still don't recover the cost of service. How is that possible? We took an in-depth look at cost recovery in our recent report on rethinking power sector reform that Jevgenijs just mentioned. And what we found that is in the last 30 years, the progress on cost recovery in the electricity sector has been a mere 10 percentage points. It's improved by 10 percentage points in 30 years, despite enormous efforts from the development community to try and move the sector to a more sustainable basis. Not only that, but we found that in half of the countries we looked at, cost recovery improved, and in the other half, it got worse over that time period. And if we look at individual countries, we found that cost recovery was a moving target. Even if it improved momentarily for a couple of years, the sector was highly subject to cost shocks of various kinds that would then, thwart the achievement of the cost recovery goal. So high tariffs that still don't recover costs. So how is that possible? Well, one of the reasons is that regulators struggle to implement cost recovery tariffs. Around the world, about 70% of developing countries have regulatory agencies in place whose main objective is to achieve cost recovery. However, in practice, this has proved very difficult. You can see in the top chart there that the practice of regulation in blue lags far behind the regulations on paper. Because due to political pressures and lack of regulatory independence, regulators are rarely able to actually implement cost recovery tariffs even after they've estimated what they should be. The main exception that we found to this pattern, as you'll see in the top right hand of the slide, is that in countries where the private sector is running the distribution sector, they are able to reach cost recovery, whereas if the state remains in control, it's very difficult. You might say the solution then is to have the private sector come in, but that has proved very, very difficult in power distribution. And we have certainly examples where privatization has taken place and has subsequently been reversed due to public discontent around tariff hikes. So the solution is not straightforward. So if we have these high tariffs that don't recover costs and this difficulty of adjusting tariffs for political reasons, really, we need to look more at the cost side of the equation rather than the tariff side of the equation. And there we find that indeed there are very high levels of inefficiency in developing country power utilities. The level of distribution losses is one indicator of high costs, and you can see that in the developing countries, the distribution losses there in yellow and red are very much higher, maybe 3 times higher than you'd expect in a well-performing high-income country. You have examples like India there with particularly egregious levels of distribution losses, which we can visualize in this photograph of informality in the power sector and what that really means in practice. Now, of course, inefficiency not only affects the distribution tier, but it may often affect also the generation tier of the power sector. Jevgenijs gave us some nice examples there also from India about the inefficiencies in coal-fired power stations. But we have all kinds of examples of, lack of economic dispatch, in uncompetitive procurement of power plants, lack of planning so that there is no least cost selection of generation technologies. So there are many reasons why costs are inflated all the way along the electricity supply chain. As a result of this, utilities continue to represent a major quasi-fiscal or quasi-fiscal burden on the public purse. In Africa and indeed across the developing world, it's not unusual for the quasi-fiscal deficit of the power sector to be about 1% of GDP. That's, I would say, a median value. And in the worst cases, we see up to 3 to 6% of GDP associated with the quasi-fiscal deficit of the power sector. So what we have here is the irony, if you like, that on the one hand, the poor households may not be able to afford to pay for electricity, but on the other hand, the governments in the lower income countries may not be able to afford to subsidize the electricity sector either. So from both the government side and the consumer side, we have this double bind of affordability. Of course, underlying the inflated costs that we see in the power sector are deficiencies in governance. And this is a topic that's also been raised in our chat box in the last half hour. So I wanted to acknowledge that. In our research, we have looked at the extent to which more efficient performance of utilities is associated with good governance practices. And we find that indeed, good performers on efficiency in blue also are much more likely to be adopting good governance practices, such as financial transparency and disclosure, meritocratic human resource policies, and stable governance of boards. So clearly, this is an important agenda for electricity. And perhaps finally, just to leave you with perhaps what really underlies the governance challenge, which is politics, and the fact that power is an intensely political sector in the developing world and has in many parts of the world been a focus for patronage politics. Essentially, the scale of the power sector is large in developing economies. It's really an important mover of financial resources. And therefore, it's a natural temptation to use power as an election winning ploy, keeping prices down to win elections, or indeed, supporting prestige projects to cut ribbons ahead of elections while diverting maintenance funds that are often, lacking and are behind the deficient quality of service that we see. Once the election's been won, the power utility then becomes potentially an instrument for distributing political favors to different constituencies, whether by prioritizing access or through the adjudication of contracts and employment opportunities. So I'd like to leave it there. I just, once again want to congratulate Jevgenijs on a very thorough treatment of the difficulties in understanding development linkages in the power sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian, for those really insightful comments, and thanks for preparing an extra PowerPoint. That was really helpful to follow along and really informative. So Jevgenijs, what I think I'll do is I will try to maybe summarize some of the questions that came in from the chat, and then turn it back to you to maybe reply to both. Any reflections you have from Vivian's comments, and then any thoughts you have on the questions that came in. I'll try to be brief so that leaving most of the time for you, and then maybe Vivian, if you wanted to come in afterwards as well on some of the questions. You already anticipated the answers to some of them, but maybe you'll have a second chance. The first question, actually, I think it dovetails really nicely from Vivian, your last point about the importance of the governance side of things. Because the first question is about the investment side of things, relating to reaching the SDGs, which is one of the SDG goal, which was one of Jevgenijs's first slides. So the question comes from, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, I'm sorry, from Mawash, which is that what has been, if there really is an investment of $50 billion per year until 2030 required to reach SDG 7, what has been the real investment so far, and are we going to reach this goal? And I want you to take the opportunity to maybe reflect on, is it the investment or is it the governance, and what is your thought on the relationship between the two? Because I think we can separate those two discussions, but obviously they're ultimately linked. Somebody asked a different question. You didn't mention the doing business, which as whether that's a useful indicator for evaluating electricity availability. Just if you have any thoughts on that. Somebody else, sorry, that was Nadia. Frederick asks about the governance issues. So clearly there's a lot of people thinking about the governance issues. A slightly more technical point from Frederick as well, which is how can CGE models be applied in markets which are imperfect, administered, and subject to outages? So any response to that? And then Mike Toman asks a question about which, I'm going to try to summarize a little bit, which is sort of some of the RCT and most of the IV literature is about marginal changes. And really some of the questions are sort of these general equilibrium questions. This Vivian also made some allusion to this point. And he's asking whether only your Brazil work really gets into this, or if there's some other literature out there that also attempts to sort of look at more of the GE effects. Frederick also mentioned something about impact on education, maybe not so surprising, since effects are expected to work themselves out over the medium to long run because they depend on the stock and slowly changing availability with potentially diminishing returns. So I'm not sure you want to pick up on that or just leave it as a comment from Frederick. So Teboho asked the question of whether it's an issue of electricity, but now we have these complementary things like data. And so Teboho says, to me, I'm realizing that my family needs data as much as they need electricity these days. What are the trends in the world, in your opinion? You should feel free to sort of say that's outside the scope, but curious to hear your views. Mike Toman then asks a question to Vivian, and I'm just going to put it out there, Vivian, so when it comes back to you, you can respond to it, which is that, Vivian, can you say a little bit more about what the World Bank needs to do on the data side in this topic area? For example, you show the high level of tariffs, but as other bank colleagues have shown, tariffs are only a fraction of actual costs in Africa. And then somebody asks why electricity prices are so high in developing countries where the cost of supply should not be that high, low labor costs, no reason to have capital costs that are higher, although I think maybe Vivian's point about it's not just the cost side, it's also the efficiency on the distribution side. So any reflections on that as to whether your views on the cost side. I have, okay, Stuti asked a question, but Stuti, I will ask if you can put a question in the chat about that we can relay it to Vivian. Tuan asks whether the cost recovery question is really so important. So I'm just going to read his question. Going back to the marginal cost controversy between coast and hoteling and maybe public finance 101, why wouldn't we think that marginal cost pricing and recovering of fixed investments and or operating costs via taxes would be socially desirable? And I realize I read that quickly, so feel free to go back and have a read it out in the chat. Okay, two more, and then I'll turn it back. So Sarosh asks, I am interested in knowing whether there is any information about how much roads, or is it just highways, contribute to the absence of electricity. I'm trying to better understand the complementarity between these two infrastructure types. And I'm going to use the opportunity to have chair's privilege to insert my own question right there, which is to Jevgenijs, which you presented your results initially as being just about the impact of electricity. But then you made a compelling case about how actually highly correlated with that electricity rollout was the complementary input of roads. And maybe I missed it in the presentation, but are you actually, in the initial set of results, able to tease out the impact of electricity vis-a-vis these other things? Or should we be looking at those results as the combination of the two? Apologies if I missed that. Just two more from the chat. Jad asks a very big picture question. Do we have any estimates on the capital investment replacement cost / replacement costs associated with the transition towards green energy? That's a big question. Teresa asks a question on reconciling results across methods. Isn't it also the case that the results from Brazil, like RCTs, lack external validity? And can you really ignore the short term, in parentheses, lack of impact in countries where there may be other constraints to growth that may bind? Okay. So with the acknowledgement that Stuti is writing a question on politics, so we'll make sure to try to give her a little bit of question at the time, give her some time to write a question. I'm going to turn it back to you, Jevgenijs. You know, there's a lot of questions. You don't necessarily have to answer all of them, but if you could give it a shot at some of the ones you think are most salient, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dion, for rigorously documenting all the questions. And thank you very much, Vivian, for your excellent discussion. I don't want to say a lot about Vivian's discussion, in part because I agree with what Vivian have said. You know, I don't think anything, you know, there are major sources of disagreement of Vivian and I on your discussion. I think Vivian's discussion was super important because she emphasized an important but possibly subtle point which I may have not hammered through in my presentation. Even if methodological challenges are fully addressed and we find a significant positive effect of electrification on development outcomes, which may or may not be true, I'm just giving a hypothetical case, a most logical outcome coming out of these results is, well, we need to increase investment in power generation capacity. We need to get more access and more generation and more transmission and more distribution So we get more development. But what Vivian is trying to say, that's not necessarily the case, right? We need to look at different types of margins. We need to look at the extensive margin, which is increasing generation capacity, but we also need to look at the intensive margin, improving the governance of the power sector. And what Vivian is trying to say from the practitioner standpoint, the latter can be more important than the former. And, I enthusiastically agree with that. I would love to say more about this in my talk. Unfortunately, I was time constrained. So Vivian very nicely filled this important gap. I also agree with Vivian that what I'm trying to measure, and I think I intentionally limited myself not to get drawn in an important set of other questions to purely economic measures of performance. But of course, social well-being also matters. Human development effects of electrification are highly important, and I'm sure Dion, who spent his life career on human development, would enthusiastically agree with that fairly uncontroversial point. Likewise, there are other problems like climate change effects coming from energy availability, something I didn't even talk about because I didn't have time, but that's another important externality that affects economic well-being of the world. Finally, I also want to agree with Vivian on the point that political economic considerations are highly important. So even if the economic models and research findings are telling us that you have to do this, you have to increase capacity, or you need to improve the governance, and you'll get significant economic effects, very often politicians are not willing to go down that route because they have many competing demands. And understanding why politicians choose one type of way of incentivizing infrastructure investment versus others is highly important. And in fact, I plan, spend the next couple of years working on this particular set of issues. That's something I prioritize in my own research agenda. Now, let me try to briefly answer the questions. I tried to do my best in terms of documenting them. Unfortunately, I may have messed up and didn't put all of them, so please don't take it personally if I didn't answer them accurately enough. I'm very glad to follow up directly on any points which are not answered. I'm open to email questions and other follow-up questions. So on the first question, I believe, was about the state of investment in electrification so far versus the desired investment. And the answer to that question is it's extremely difficult to measure. I'll be very honest. I think International Energy Agency, which came up with the numbers, came up with their own methodology and their own assessment. But as any methodology, it's not coming without its own flaws. So any number should be taken with some grain of salt. But if we believe International Energy Agency, the current investment is about 50% lower than necessary to bridge the access gap. I think this is something that I said in my presentation. As regards whether public or private investment is necessary, that's a topic of both my ongoing work and Vivian's ongoing work. I think Vivian in her discussion spent a lot of caveats about when public investment is necessary and when private investment is more desirable. Obviously, the economic theory says that public investment is more desirable when we have significant externalities that needs to be corrected, and private sector is difficult. So in terms of electric power, this is largely transmission infrastructure investment as opposed to investment in generation, which can be done by the private sector. However, the private investment is difficult because there are many bottlenecks to the private investment, and these are coming from the regulatory issues, the governance issues, and other issues which impede the cost of doing business in electric power generation. I would also like to point attention of the audience to the upcoming work of the IFC coming later this fall on creating power markets, which basically spends a great deal of time discussing the issues related to power, private sector participation in power sector. So that's a work I strongly recommend to read. With full disclosure, I was actively involved in preparing that report. As regards doing business, that's definitely the World Bank flagship publication. As any publication, as any methodological work, is not without its own controversies, which are very well known and documented. I think it's a very valuable source in terms of understanding electricity access, but of course that's not the only source. So usually if you want to understand things, you want to look at different sources and compare them. That's what a researcher would tell. So you want to look at the doing business, you want to look what energy and extractive global practice in the bank done in terms of multi-tier framework. I think it's extremely valuable data source. You need to check the highly ambitious and valuable RISE project, which covers electricity access, again done by ESMAP. In the World Bank, and there are other measures of electricity access done in both academia and policy community. So my short answer, there is no single source that can tell what matters and what's not. So you need to look and compare. As regards the CG models and Frederick's question about imperfections, I of course agree with that. One of the limitations of the CG models that I did mention in my critique of them is that they assume fully functioning markets. That's always clear, which is almost never the case. To somewhat a defense of CG models, we need to understand that when we do the CG models, we're really typically looking at the very long-term effects. And in the long term, markets are more likely to clear than in the short term. Also, I think there is some work in the CG community to introduce some sort of market imperfections. That's still ongoing and highly important process.
Jevgenijs?
Yes.
I just want to make sure we are able to leave a little time for Vivian at the end. So if you don't mind wrapping up in the next 3 minutes or so. And I realize you might not be able to get to all the questions, and that's okay. You can pick and choose the ones you think you can really respond to.
Understood. Sure. So let me go very, very briefly on the rest of the questions. As regards local versus general equilibrium effects and the importance of Brazil work, I do think Brazil work was important, and I cannot criticize myself, so there is certainly a bias to that. And I agree enthusiastically that ideally you want to look and test the same effects using different methods. I do believe in methodological pluralism. Want to see what different methods are telling us, and we need to be of constraints of these methods. So if different methods point to the same direction, that's good news. As regards to availability of data versus electricity, these things are interestingly connected. The big data literature and electricity nexus is a turbulent and rapidly emerging strand of research, and I think I suggest to follow what happens. Why electricity prices are so high? I think Vivian is better positioned to answer that question, though in part because that's right. Cost of service can be lower in terms of certain factors, but can be far higher in terms of others. So I would let Vivian speak on that. Why cost recovery is important? The brief answer is the paper by a set of papers by Jean-Jacques Lafon and Jean Tirole, who spent a great deal of time explaining why this is the case. I'm happy to provide references. And the last question I want to talk about is electricity and roads. Most of my work covers the electricity sector only, and we're trying to isolate the effects of electricity. But the more I work on electricity, the more I realize we cannot just look at electricity alone, right? So if I were to recommend where research should go, we need to look at infrastructure complementarities. I think that's it.
Okay, Jevgenijs, and apologies for rushing you along. Just before turning to Vivian, there are 2 more questions that sort of came with you in mind, so I'm gonna put them in your hamper as well, and please feel free to pick and choose what you respond to. Stuti asks says that she doesn't think we've invested sufficiently in understanding the politics of electricity, and it is indeed important if we want to succeed with reforms. So she points to an example where she conducted a survey, and they found in India And they found that highly educated and high-income respondents, including doctors, are more likely to demand free electricity than low-income village respondents and local village level politics. So she's obviously pointing to maybe something that goes contrary to what we might have expected. And then Frederick asked another question, which is also sort of related to governance, the governance side of things, which is in these numbers like the 50 billion per year infrastructure investment, do these estimates take into account the I guess the way he phrases it, the nasty effective infrastructure investment expenditures due to, I'm assuming means poor governance. So are we spending more to make up for poor governance, I guess is essentially the point. So over to you, Vivian, and we have about 9 to 10
Thanks, Dale. Do we have a hard stop at 12:30? Will we be disconnected?
I don't know for sure, Ryan.
There's no hard stop from the IT,
I'll
from the
do my
streaming
best in any
perspective.
case. Okay, thanks. So thanks, really a wealth of questions, and Yev's already picked up on a number of them. So I'll pick out a few. So first of all, are countries investing more in electrification, and will we reach the SDG 7 target? I would refer you to the Energy Progress Report that recently came out by the World Bank and other custodian agencies on this topic. But the short answer would be that certainly in some parts of the world, governments are really putting more political capital behind electrification and are putting serious money behind it. And where that happens, we see that it is relatively easy to accelerate electrification when the political will is there. I mean, the most, striking example is India, where there's been an enormous effort to increase electrification very rapidly. But also certain African countries. Kenya is actually, we did a historic look. It's the fastest electrifier ever that we've found. And one of the reasons for that is that with the availability of off-grid energy now, there are actually cheaper solutions to reach outlying remote areas. And so we do have that ability to complement grid electricity with cheap off-grid solutions. So I think it's a hopeful time for electrification, even if as a whole there are not enough countries taking it seriously enough that we'll meet the SDG 7 target right now, but we're moving in the right direction. On electricity or data, I just wanted to mention that I think there are a number of countries where the penetration of cell phones exceeds electricity coverage of households. So obviously households are dealing with that difficulty. But we also have econometric evidence that the presence of electricity, supports uptake of digital services. So that's an area of, I think, of strong complementarity. Why the costs are so high? Well, labor costs are not so relevant here. It's a very capital intensive industry. And costs of capital may be very high due to the riskiness of the countries that we're talking about. So even apart from all of the inefficiency issues that I documented, I think the capital intensive nature and the high cost of capital and the high risk already helps to explain partly why costs are high. On the importance of cost recovery, it's interesting to go back to the real textbook or the classic articles on this topic. I think that even if there's a microeconomic case for taxation taxation financing of the sector, I think from a broader public finance perspective, there are very few public services where user charges are really a possibility. And so if for countries that have very limited tax revenues, it would be very difficult. It's difficult, I think, to not to make full use of user charges to fund services where there's a real client relationship with the user that can be exploited in that sense. Then I think on the complementarity on roads and energy, I wanted to mention that the complementarity is both on the supply side and on the demand side. So we have what we call a dig once kind of policy in the infrastructure sectors, where we get a lot of cost savings if we just dig once on a trunk on an intercity corridor and do roads, power transmission, and actually fiber optic digital services. So we're trying to encourage that kind of a bundling at the construction stage. But I think there are also complementarities on the demand side. I mean, electricity may increase my productivity, but if I don't have good roads to be able to reliably deliver to market, then my ability to capture that value may be limited. So I can see the complementarities both on the supply and the demand side. Regarding the cost of transition to green energy, the IEA has World Energy Outlook that comes out annually, has very authoritative estimates of what these costs are. But the important point to note is that they've been falling dramatically over time as the technological change in the sector has made renewable energies increasingly actually competitive with fossil fuels in an increasing number of settings. And that is definitely helping to accelerate momentum. If we turn the clock back 10, 15 years, many developing countries questioned whether they should pay more for green energy, given that they were not part of the climate change problem originally. But now I think there's much more consensus that clean energy is financially attractive to all parties. Did the $50 billion include inefficiencies? Probably not very well. Those kind of numbers are very much a high level, back of the envelope based on engineering parameters usually. So I would think they're probably a lower bound if we're thinking of inefficiency. What can the World Bank do on the data agenda for the power sector? Well, I think that it's a multi-pronged effort. I think, first of all, we need to improve the survey instruments that we have. Both the household surveys and the enterprise surveys have valuable information, but they're not, they don't always go deep enough. And there are, I think, many ways that the design of the survey instruments could be strengthened. Then I think at the country level, right now the national statistical offices really don't have any jurisdiction or oversight or play much of a role for energy sector data. It's very much stuck in the administrative data. And I think that's one of the challenges. We've made a lot of progress on energy balances, the actual macro picture of energy in, energy out. But when it comes to the actual utility sector, the prices, the efficiency, the financial performance, it's a very murky area where the bank does a lot of work, but there's really not a system to improve this over time in the countries. And I think that's where we need to work. And then finally, on the politics, yes, I couldn't agree more on the importance of understanding the politics. One of the recommendations of the Rethinking Power Sector Reform report was to do political economy analysis more systematically as we try to define reform processes. And there's a whole chapter on political economy in that report, which I would refer you to. But as you say, it's striking that even the rich may want free electricity, which really goes back to this idea of, what is the social contract around electricity? What is the kind of ideological, aura of the sector, which is kind of, governing people's demands, and they need to kind of really shift that focus towards a more user charge basis. Of course, that's difficult when users are getting a poor service. It's one thing to pay for a good service, but if it's a very poor service, it's much harder to build that kind of contract with users. So that's a quick set of reactions. But thanks for all those questions.
Thanks for that. About a tour de force in 7 minutes, I think.
Can I add just one last remark?
Sure, let's give you the absolute last word, and then we'll close the session. Thanks.
I just want to reflect on the last question about Sudi's question on sociology, actually politics, but I also call it sociology of power sector. I want to double down on the point that it's extremely important to understand what people think. Recently, there was a very interesting paper by Michael Greenstone and colleagues called "Electricity is Not a Right." Something that where they accurately document that that the people's belief that the electricity should be a free service actually does a bad service for electrification, and I think it's a very important paper to read. What is not known, and which is much less known, is why people think that way, and what drives people's beliefs. And I think these explorations should be highly important on the future work in terms of political economy of the power sector reform. Thanks. Just a brief remark.
No, thanks. And Stuti is adding a little precision to her, something that I glossed over, which is in her case, it was the rich even more so than the poor. It wasn't even that it was the rich and the poor. It was so confounding our expectations more generally. Yeah. Anyway, with that, I really want to thank you for a great, rich discussion, excellent presentation, Jevgenijs, and some fabulous follow-on comments, and then responses to the questions from both of you. I think I've learned a lot from this exchange, and I hope the audience has as well. Thank you for the comments that came in the chat, both on WebEx and YouTube. And then also you'll see in the chat, there's a link to the website where we will be putting the presentation, the PowerPoints, as well as the recording of the session online. So for those of you who want to refer to it back in the future. So with that, I really want to thank you all for your participation and close the session. Thank you very much, Vivian, for being discussant.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.